Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
Welcome to this episode of Street Soldiers on police reform. Policing in America is under scrutiny. Governments are taking action to overhaul the way police do their jobs. Some people say it's too much too soon, while others say it doesn't go far enough. Some activists believe the police killing of George Floyd might never have come to light if there was no video. They may be right. While local police departments are supposed to report deaths in police custody to the FBI, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries says only about 40% actually provide those numbers. He believes it's time for consistency from coast to coast.
Right now, there are thousands of police departments across the country, none of whom operate with a uniform standard on when force should be used and how do we measure instances when police officers cross the line. That is why we need a national standard.
New York State lawmakers have moved swiftly in response to the public outcry. The legislature passed the Eric Garner Anti-Chokehold Act, making it a crime for a police officer to use it. It carries a 15-year maximum penalty.
My Eric Garner anti-chokehold bill passed the Senate 62-0. Every Democrat and Republican voted for it because people across the board said, you know what, enough is enough. We do need some police accountability.
The New York City Council is initiating its own measures. In many cases, officers who use excessive force have been involved in previous serious incidents. So an early warning system is essential, says City Council member Vanessa Gibson.
We want to identify warning signs of officers that accumulate excessive substantiated CCRB cases and excessive lawsuits that the city settles. It's a warning sign. Something's wrong with that officer.
PBA President Pat Lynch, in representing tens of thousands of law enforcement officers statewide, says police have had no input in sweeping changes that could put public safety at risk.
Why aren't you asking the question of professional law enforcement? Why aren't you seeking our advice? Is it that maybe we'd be reasonable? Maybe we can see where the problems would be?
Welcome to this episode of Street Soldiers. Joining us now is City Council member Vanessa Gibson. She is a member of the Public Safety Committee, its former chair. She's representing the Bronx. Vanessa, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Lisa. Good to see you as always.
Thank you so much. Good to see you. Also joining us is Dr. Robert Gonzalez. He is an assistant professor of criminal justice at St. John's University and also a former deputy assistant commissioner of training with the NYPD. And he was a uniformed NYPD officer and sergeant for nearly 20 years. Dr. Gonzalez, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate it. Also with us is attorney Philip Hamilton. He's a former Bronx public defender. He is now a partner in the firm Hamilton Clark LLP, specializing in criminal defense and civil rights law. Vanessa, let me start with you on this because you've been key and very involved in a lot of the legislation that is already on the books in terms of how police operate in our communities. Where do you see us right now in kind of the big picture?
I really do see this as a real moment in time and a moment in history for all of the stakeholders to come together and really redefine policing in America. I think what you're seeing now is civil unrest where Black and brown New Yorkers are tired of seeing brothers and sisters unfortunately injured and or killed by police violence, not just in New York, but across America. And when we all see the video of George Floyd and what happened to him in Minneapolis, it's heartbreaking. You would be inhumane to not be affected by that video, whether you're Black or brown or not. And I think many people have seen over the years that we elected officials have worked with the NYPD over the years on building relationships, establishing the NCO program, building community policing, and really looking at policing from a different perspective, understanding that police officers, just as civilians, just want to be protected, just want to be safe, just want to make sure that at the end of the day, we all go home the same way we left our homes. And I do think, again, this is a defining moment for us. I have seen a lot of progress in New York City over my tenure in the council the past 7 years, but I do think what we've seen now is really a little bit of a setback, but I'm a firm believer in every setback being preparation for a comeback. And I think it's not just legislation, it's really about the behavior of both police officers and civilians, how we all hold ourselves accountable.
Let me bring Dr. Gonzalez in. Dr. Gonzalez, Vanessa Gibson brought up the social distancing thing, but there's been this perception, supported by many facts, going back to the stop and frisk era, that what is tolerated and what is the practice and the normal way of policing in Black and brown communities would never be tolerated in more affluent or in white communities. You were on the streets for more than 20 years, a sergeant, a supervisor, part of that. What do you say to people who have been complaining about that and are backed up by all of the research and the numbers and even the NYPD's own statistics?
Unfortunately, we have seen different communities get policed differently. Higher socioeconomic communities do get policed different than lower socioeconomic communities. I mean, there's data to support that. I think the NYPD has attempted to make strides in trying to bridge those gaps, tried to revamp training so that officers actually go out and enforce lawfully, ethically, and morally correct. But unfortunately, we see situations, not just here in New York City, but also nationally, especially with George Floyd, where it's just a horrendous act where you see a police officer who's aggressively using a choking tactic that's banned here in New York City.
Phil, when you see what's happening right now in New York City, what's your take on where policing is? Because there's so many changes happening so fast, but how badly needed do you think they were, especially in communities of color?
I mean, the reform measures in terms of bringing more accountability, especially as Dr. Gonzalez hits upon the fact that we have sometimes two different styles of policing. One, say, so much in the South Bronx, as opposed to maybe half a mile away on the Upper East Side, right? We have two totally different styles, and I think a lot of it is when policing in the South Bronx, not to say that any officers are, or all officers are good, all officers are bad, you're gonna have some of both. The problem was with respect to the bad officers, especially that you would see in the South Bronx, there was just no accountability. The people there didn't have a lot of the power to be able to, forcefully make the CCRB complaints or to forcefully be able to get in touch with, the precinct or, one police plaza to say, hey, this particular officer was completely and totally, inappropriate in its handling. There was misconduct, maybe some excessive force. There just wasn't that power and there wasn't the accountability. Even to the extent you had those complaints being made, you had situations where, even if you had substantiated allegations of misconduct or excessive force against an officer, those records were ultimately being shielded by the Civil Rights Law 50A. So when we look back to last Friday with Governor Cuomo signing off on the repeal of 50A, these are big starts. Okay, we still have a long way to go, but in terms of just feeling a little bit optimistic about where policing can go moving forward, I feel good because it starts first and foremost with accountability.
What do you say to New Yorkers who just feel like, the cops can get away with anything when they cross the line?
I say to all New Yorkers, continue to do exactly what you're doing. The protests, the demonstrations are a part of history and a part of a defining moment. And it really does stimulate change. A lot of the legislation, like the chokehold bill, like the right to record, my bill is the Post Act, which relates to police surveillance. A lot of those bills have languished for years, but now the time has come when these bills are finally passing. I see a lot on the ground. I'm out in the district every day feeding residents and giving out PPE. I talk to seniors that care about quality of life issues, that care about loitering, they care about the noise, the marijuana. They talk about all these things. They want to see more police. They don't want police abusing young Black and brown kids, but they want to see police on the streets. They want to see patrol. But I also hear from young people that say they mess with us, they just try to target us, they harass us. And we just want to be safe. We just want to recreate. We want programs. We want jobs. We want summer activities. We just want to be left alone, right? I see both. And then I have a district, like Phil said and like Dr. Rob knows, in the Bronx, where I have shootings all the time. I have violence, I have robberies, I have domestic incidents. So it's a real challenge to ask for more police, but also make sure that there's a process by which we monitor their activities, we streamline, their behavior, and we make sure they're held accountable just like everyone else.
Dr. Robert Gonzalez, we've seen some NYPD precincts where they're very community-minded, where the chief for that particular part of the borough, like Chief Madry in Brooklyn North, they're doing a lot of work with the community and engaging them, and really working with them. But there are other places where a lot of people are saying, okay, as City Council Member Gibson said, yes, there's still people that are really committing crime, but it's always been that distinction of just you're assumed guilty because of your skin color or because of your race or because of your ethnicity that has offended so many people. So give us the police officer's perspective. Put us in the mindset of an officer on the streets right now where they have to make sure people are being protected and yet also make sure people's rights are not being violated. Why is it so hard to find that place right in the middle of balance and justice for all?
Well, I just think right now, I mean, we can't hide behind the fact that police officers feel that they're not getting the support from the leadership of the NYPD. They're not getting the support from City Hall at this particular point. So they have no real guidance. They really don't know what to do. If they take action, it's scrutinized heavily, both by local politicians, both by the media, and also internally within the department. So it's almost like the police officers have no guidance. They don't know which direction to go. You know, and I feel bad for them. They need to go back to grassroots training. They need to reinstill the nobility of policing with these police officers, remove the cynicism that is inherent within the NYPD and other agencies, right? So again, they have to go back to quality training. They have to reinforce why they became police officers and get these officers, you know, to have a purpose. And right now, they don't feel like they have any real purpose because they're lacking support, they're lacking training, and they're lacking guidance.
Bill Hamilton, from your perspective, in terms of people being unjustly accused, what's been your experience about that?
In terms of like the citizenry being unjustly accused,
like especially when you were working with Bronx defenders, people being unfairly accused or being harshly punished for things that were minor.
I mean, I think that's what keeps me positive about change, because during my time at the Bronx Defenders, you're looking back between 2009 and 2015. So in the first few years of my tenure there, you still had a lot of the stop and frisk policies, you know, that had been initiated by, you know, Giuliani and super ramped up by Bloomberg. They were still very much so in effect. So I would get into arraignments on any given Sunday night. You know, the pens would just be filled with hundreds of people, not in there on, you know, serious felonies, but on those broken windows, you know, just minuscule offenses that, you know, to the extent a lot of them didn't commit, whether it was a trespass, whether it was, you know, a simple marijuana possession, even though the marijuana wasn't in public view, but we were just having these stop and frisk situations where police officers were going into people's pockets, pulling the stuff out, putting it in the public view, and basically manufacturing charges. Now, that was at the beginning of my tenure, but now it's not like that anymore. So that's why I say I do have an appreciation and a belief that things can ultimately get better, because I've seen the systemic change just from what it used to be like in 2011, as opposed to now. It's not perfect now. You still have people getting stopped and frisked. You still have people sometimes coming up on charges that they're not necessarily guilty of or being falsely accused. However, do I see a total change since 2010, 2011, based upon a lot of, you know, the local legislation that Councilwoman Gibson is speaking about? Absolutely. So the police, you know, the NYPD, they're totally capable of change. And so, as Dr. Gonzalez said, we need to kind of take this moment as a grassroots approach to new training to kind of keep the buck moving forward, so that we're not dealing with these issues of George Floyd and every other name that I just don't feel like going down right now, because we know that there's
the list is so long. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with more of this special episode of Street Soldiers on police reform. Still to come, our guests weigh in on what real police reform looks like. Bill, let me start with you. In terms of the role of police, it seems like there's a big debate right now, public debate, about what it should be, that this throw them up against the wall, pat them down and see if they have a gun is out, and something else needs to come in, but it doesn't seem like there's a clear picture. What's your take on that?
I think what needs to come in is just a little bit more fair and equitable policing. So when we hear a lot of the uproar and a lot of the disgust with that kind of rough and tumble Nixon, Reagan era, you know, tough on crime, get against the wall, you know, let me pat you down type of policing, I just think what we're realizing with a lot of the unrest and a lot of the protests is that people are tired of it, because it is just a police culture that in many respects just goes unaccountable. It's a kind of rogue style of policing, at least as the public takes it in. And it's just something that makes people who don't live on the Upper East Side or who don't live in some of the more socioeconomic, you know, well-to-do neighborhoods just feel unjustly policed. And it leads to these kinds of situations where when you're dealing with this, you know, police versus community as opposed to police protecting community type of culture, it leads to these situations where it's an us versus them, and you have men ending up dying on the street, be it in chokeholds, be it with knees on the backs of their necks, in a way that if the approach to the police and what policing was supposed to be about was not so much of an us versus them, but a community style of policing as a whole, maybe you don't have these kinds of situations going on. And I think that's what people are optimistic about and hoping about and demanding moving forward.
Dr. Robert Gonzalez, what about that? We keep hearing this term community policing. We've heard it for years. When Commissioner O'Neill was in charge, he was talking about the neighborhood policing, having officers that basically had relationships with the community. They were showing a lot of progress with that, but was that ever really accepted by rank and file police officers or by the brass, do you think?
I think the rank and file, they did have a challenge trying to acclimate to the new community policing model. What we saw over history, it's not just the Silver Shield police officers that don't buy into it, it's also supervision and management. Right now, with most of these high profile incidents that take place, there's always a breakdown in supervision. So if you look at the old community policing model, you look at the current community policing model, if you don't have first line supervisors monitoring their personnel out in the field, you're gonna have situations like what happened with George Floyd, what happened with Eric Garner. So there has to be a revamp of first line supervision and law enforcement so that they can keep an eye on those police officers that are on the field, often most of their tour unsupervised.
City Council member Vanessa Gibson, there's a big sense in the community, as you know, that people feel there's two systems of justice, one for whites, one for blacks, and maybe even three, and then one for police officers, that no matter what laws get passed, there's a skepticism, no matter what laws get passed, nothing is really going to change. What do you think about that? And guys, jump into.
I agree, and I really understand and sympathize, because we have seen for far too long in communities of color where there's an over-policing, there's an aggression by some police officers, not all, but in other communities where you see large gatherings, they're being given face masks and hand sanitizers, and we are being aggressively targeted. And that's been a problem. And then when you talk about a system of justice, is the system really fair to everyone? So when you look at Black and brown individuals that are through the criminal justice system, there's a different level of justice as compared to everyone else. And holding those police officers that are accused of misconduct through the CCRV process and through other mechanisms in the city. And, you know, let's be very honest, the police unions have not been a real partner in this process. Sometimes they're a barrier to progress, whether it's legislation or any other measure that we're trying to do. The legislation is key, but I also think that it's the implementation and the enforcement. If you have a city of, you know, 8.6 million New Yorkers, a variety of different communities, but you enforce the law in different communities in different ways, you're going to see exactly what you've seen over the past several years. And that cannot happen.
Phil, in terms of the laws that were passed, this Eric Garner bill and this 50A, what are these bills going to do?
Well, outright, we finally now, we already had a ban on chokeholds with respect to internally at the NYPD since 1993, but now it's on the books in the New York penal law that to the extent if you have a chokehold situation like what we saw with Eric Garner, or even one that doesn't lead to, you know, a death, you're looking at up to 15 years in prison. So I think that that's like a good deterrent measure to kind of be in the back of, you know, officers' minds to remind them that, you know, the chokehold is just not an acceptable measure. We have now, you know, Governor Cuomo having signed into law the repeal of Civil Rights Law 58, which I touched upon earlier, was a law that in many respects shielded the personnel records of NYPD, corrections officers, FDNY, to the extent that you had bad apples within the force that had, you know, records of misconduct, records of excessive force, and you couldn't see it. Now we are going to be able to see it. We're going to be able to put in those FOIL requests. The press can put in the FOIL requests. It will allow these officers to be better scrutinized and for there to be better accountability. You know, we have the situation now where in terms of the false 911 calls that people were making, we think back to Amy Cooper a couple of weeks ago. You know, that now is going to be outlawed to the extent that people are just unjustly calling the police on Black people for just living life, right? For not doing anything wrong, for just, you know, standing around in a park watching birds. You know, that's no longer going to cut it here in New York. So what we're seeing, I think, is positive change. And, you know, to the extent we hate what happened with Mr. Floyd, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And it's got to be heartbreaking enough for society to be in a situation where we're not going to let his death in any way be in vain. And these first reform measures that we're seeing being passed, they were already written a long time ago. That's why I was able to get through the process so quickly, okay? But this was the moment finally where we were able to push it through. And, you know, it feels good to be able to see some of this change and to be able to see better measures of accountability, because I think that's better for the community.
Vanessa, in terms of the city council's considering a lot of different laws, but a lot of the laws too that rule the police department and govern their behavior are state laws. What do you think, that, from your point of view and all your experience, what do you think the city council can actually do that would be the most effective and really help restore public faith in the police and kind of try to bridge that gap right now of distrust?
Right. So I think obviously what the state legislature did last week was incredible. And this is really a moment in time. It's a moment in our history in America and in New York City. And I believe that the death and the horrific murder of George Floyd is really an opportunity to wake up a sleeping nation. People were sleeping as a country on racism in America, and now people are waking up. We don't have a choice.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of Street Soldiers. I'm Lisa Evers. Remember, use your mind, it's your best weapon, and let's push for peace, love, and justice for all.